Montana Territory, 1871. The early summer rains had turned the dirt road into a river of mud, but for Madeline Wright, that hardly mattered anymore. 3 years as a widow had taught her that nature's inconveniences paled against life's true hardships. At 23, she stood on her porch watching storm clouds gather above the modest homestead her husband James had built before typhoid fever claimed him during their second winter. Her long auburn hair, typically bound in a practical braid, whipped against her cheek as the wind picked up. The pale blue dress she wore, one of only 3 she owned, fluttered around her ankles. The homestead wasn't much: a 2-room cabin, small barn, vegetable garden, and chicken coop. But it was hers, the only thing she had left after James died. "No use feeling sorry for yourself," Madeline muttered, turning back toward the door. Living alone on the frontier had hardened something inside her. The neighbors, scattered miles apart, had been kind at first, bringing food and offering help with chores. But as months stretched into years, their visits grew less frequent. Madeline had come to believe that deep connections were luxuries the frontier didn't permit. Survival demanded all her attention, leaving no room for sentimentality or attachment. She'd convinced herself that loneliness was simply the price of independence. Better to stand alone than to love and lose again. The frontier was too harsh, too unforgiving for tender feelings. James had taught her that much when he'd left her alone in this wild country. As thunder rumbled overhead, Madeline cast one last glance toward the road before closing the door. The storm would be fierce tonight. She was grateful to have finished repairing the roof last week, though the work had left her hands rough and calloused. Such was the life of a woman alone in Montana Territory: constant work and vigilance, with no one to share the burden. The rain began to fall as she stoked the cook stove, preparing a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The howl of the wind nearly obscured another sound, a sound that didn't belong to any storm. Madeline froze, wooden spoon in hand. It came again, the distant, labored whinny of a horse. Setting the spoon down, she moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass. Through the gray curtain of rain, she could just make out a dark shape struggling along the road. A horse, moving awkwardly, with what appeared to be a figure slumped over its back. "Fool rider," she muttered, though concern immediately pricked at her conscience. No one would be out in such weather without desperate cause. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing her oilcloth coat and hat. Stepping into the downpour, she squinted through the rain. The horse had stopped at her fence line, head hanging low, a man's form draped precariously across its saddle. As Madeline approached, the rider slid sideways, tumbling into the mud with a dull thud. The horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, nickered nervously but didn't bolt. "Sir," Madeline called, kneeling beside the fallen man. "Can you hear me?" He was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a clean-shaven face streaked with mud. Blood had soaked through his shirt along his left side, mixing with rain to create a pale red puddle beneath him. His eyes fluttered open momentarily, striking blue against his mud-splattered face, before closing again. "Wake up," she urged, shaking him gently. "I cannot carry you to shelter." No response came. Sighing, Madeline struggled to her feet and caught the horse's reins. "Come on, then. We'll have to drag him." Through sheer determination, she managed to fashion a crude travois from fence rails and rope, using the man's horse to pull him to her cabin. By the time she got him inside, her blue dress was soaked through and caked with mud, her auburn hair a tangled mess. Once inside, she cut away his shirt to reveal an angry bullet wound in his side. It had missed vital organs, but had clearly festered during however many days he'd been riding. The man was burning with fever, occasionally mumbling incoherently as she cleaned and dressed the wound. In his delirium, one word came through clearly: Blackstone. He repeated it several times, his face contorting with fear or anger. She couldn't tell which. "Rest easy," Madeline told him, though she doubted he could hear. "You're safe now." The words felt strange on her tongue. Comfort wasn't something she'd offered anyone in years. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the lean strength of his frame, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work, and the absence of a wedding ring. After tending to his wound, Madeline made the stranger as comfortable as possible on her bed, taking the floor for herself. She tethered his horse in the barn alongside her own mare. noticing the quality saddle and the Winchester rifle in its scabbard. Whoever this man was, he wasn't a common drifter. As she settled onto her pallet that night, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, Madeline chided herself for her foolishness. Taking in a wounded stranger could bring nothing but trouble. Yet something had compelled her to act, perhaps the simple knowledge that without help, he would have died in the mud outside her fence. Even after 3 years of isolation, she hadn't hardened enough to let that happen. Just until he's well enough to move on, she promised herself, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Then things will return to normal. She didn't yet understand how thoroughly this stranger would challenge her carefully constructed solitude. Bradley Vance drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days. In his lucid moments, he found himself in an unfamiliar cabin with a serious-faced young woman tending to him. When fever claimed him again, his dreams were haunted by gunfire, shouts, and the face of a man he'd trusted, Jonas Blackstone, the ranch foreman who had tried to kill him. On the 4th morning, he woke clear-headed for the first time. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain lancing through his side. "You shouldn't move yet," came a woman's voice. "The bullet wound is still healing." Bradley turned his head to see her standing in the doorway, auburn hair neatly braided, wearing a simple brown dress. Her face was striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with high cheekbones, a determined chin, and eyes that seemed older than her years. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "My homestead, about 15 miles west of Fort Benton." She approached with a cup of water. "I'm Madeline Wright." "Bradley Vance," he replied after drinking deeply. "I owe you my life, Mrs. Wright." "Miss Wright," she corrected. "Or Widow Wright, if you prefer formalities. Though I've been widowed long enough that Miss serves well enough." Bradley nodded, studying her face more carefully. She couldn't be more than 25, yet she lived alone on this remote homestead. "I'm sorry for your loss," he offered. Madeline's expression didn't change. It was 3 years ago. The fever took him quickly. She changed the subject with practiced efficiency. "You've been shot. Care to explain why?" Bradley hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Trust came hard on the frontier, where a man's past often dictated his welcome. But this woman had saved him when she could have left him to die. "I worked as a ranch hand for the Double Cross outfit north of here," he began. "The owner, Mr. Harrington, went back east for the winter. While he was gone, the foreman, Jonas Blackstone, started rustling cattle from neighboring spreads. When I confronted him, he and his boys decided I was a liability. So they shot you and left you for dead," Madeline finished for him. "Yes, ma'am. I managed to get to my horse and ride out, but the fever took hold. Last thing I remember clearly is crossing Beaver Creek. Everything after that's hazy." Madeline nodded. "You showed up during the worst storm we've had this season, half dead in my yard. That was 4 days ago." "4 days," Bradley echoed, shocked at how much time he'd lost. "Miss Wright, I need to." "You need to rest," she interrupted firmly. "Whatever business you have with this Blackstone fellow will have to wait until you can stand without reopening that wound." The matter-of-fact way she spoke reminded Bradley of his mother, a woman who'd suffered no foolishness from 6 rowdy sons. He found himself nodding in agreement despite himself. "Besides," Madeline continued, "riding out half-healed would only get you killed, and I didn't spend 4 days keeping you alive just to have you throw it away on foolishness." A smile tugged at Bradley's lips despite the pain in his side. "Yes, ma'am." Something flickered across Madeline's face. Surprise, perhaps, that he'd agreed so readily. Or maybe it was the smile that caught her off guard. Bradley suspected she didn't see many smiles out here alone. "I'll bring you some broth," she said, turning toward the door. "And then you should rest more. Your body needs time to heal." As she left, Bradley stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. In his 26 years, he'd known his share of frontier hardship, but he'd always had family or fellow ranch hands nearby. The thought of this young woman facing the Montana wilderness alone for 3 years stirred something in him. Admiration mixed with a strange protectiveness he had no right to feel. More troubling was the knowledge that as long as he remained here, he brought danger to her doorstep. If Blackstone discovered he was alive, the foreman would come to finish the job, and anyone harboring him would be considered an enemy. "I'll leave as soon as I'm able," he promised himself. "No sense bringing my troubles down on her head." But as days stretched into a week, and a week into two, Bradley found himself in no hurry to depart. His strength returned gradually, and with it came an increasing awareness of Madeline Wright. Her quiet competence, her rare but transformative smile, and the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. "You don't need to do that," Madeline said, watching as Bradley split another log for the woodpile. "Your side still isn't fully healed." 3 weeks had passed since she'd dragged him from the mud. Though still favoring his left side, he'd insisted on making himself useful around the homestead. Already he'd repaired her chicken coop, mended the north fence line, and now was building up her winter wood supply. Tasks that would have taken her twice as long alone. "The work's good for me," he replied, swinging the axe with practiced ease. "Keeps the muscles from getting stiff." He set another split log on the growing pile. "Besides, it's the least I can do for your hospitality." Madeline crossed her arms, uncomfortable with how quickly his presence had become routine. She'd grown accustomed to his help with morning chores, their quiet conversations over meals, even the sound of his deep voice humming old trail songs as he worked. It was a dangerous comfort, one she couldn't afford. "You've more than earned your keep," she said firmly. "Once that side is fully healed, you should be on your way." Bradley paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied her. In the afternoon sunlight, his features were more pronounced: strong jaw, straight nose, and those startlingly blue eyes that seemed to see more than she wished to reveal. "Are you eager to be rid of me, Miss Wright?" he asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. "I'm eager for things to return to normal," she replied, though the words sounded hollow even to her ears. What was normal anymore? Endless days of solitary work, of talking to chickens for company, of telling herself that loneliness was simply the price of independence? Bradley's expression softened. "I understand. And you're right. I've imposed on your kindness long enough." He set down the axe and approached her, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'll ride out tomorrow morning." Madeline should have felt relieved. Instead, a strange hollowness opened in her chest. "Where will you go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Fort Benton first. I need to get word to Mr. Harrington about what Blackstone's been doing. After that," he shrugged, "there's always work for a good ranch hand." "Of course." Madeline nodded. "Well, we should make sure you have provisions for the journey." That evening, she prepared a better meal than usual: venison stew with dumplings and the last of her preserved peaches. They ate in a silence heavier than any they'd shared before, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or the condition of the crops. As Madeline washed the dishes afterward, Bradley stood at the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, "about Blackstone." "What about him?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "He thinks I'm dead, which gives me an advantage." Bradley turned to face her. "But once I report him to the authorities, he'll know I survived. And he'll know I was somewhere nearby all this time." The implication was clear, and a chill ran down Madeline's spine. "You think he might come looking for you here?" Bradley nodded grimly. "I can't say for certain, but men like Blackstone don't leave loose ends. If he connects me to this homestead—" He didn't finish the sentence. Madeline set her jaw. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Vance. I have for 3 years now." "I don't doubt that for a moment," he said, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "But Blackstone doesn't ride alone. He has at least 4 men loyal to him, all hardened types who wouldn't think twice about harming a woman." The thought was unsettling, but Madeline refused to show fear. "What do you propose, then? That I abandon my home on the chance these men might come looking?" "No," Bradley said firmly. "I propose you come with me to Fort Benton, just until this business is settled. The territorial marshal is there now. With his testimony and mine, Blackstone will be arrested. Once he's in custody, the danger will be past." Madeline stared at him. "Leave my homestead? My animals? My garden? Everything I've worked for? Just for a week?" "2 at most," Bradley insisted. "Your neighbor to the south, Fletcher, you mentioned him? Couldn't he look after things for that long?" "Old Mr. Fletcher has his own place to manage," Madeline protested, though she knew the elderly man would help if asked. He'd offered assistance many times since James died. Bradley crossed the room to stand before her. "Madeline," he said softly, the first time he'd used her given name, "I couldn't bear it if harm came to you because of me. Please consider it." The genuine concern in his eyes made her breath catch. It had been so long since anyone had worried for her safety, had looked at her as something precious rather than pitiable. "I'll think about it," she conceded finally, stepping back to put distance between them. "But I make no promises." That night, Madeline lay awake long after Bradley's breathing had deepened into sleep. The thought of leaving her homestead terrified her almost as much as the prospect of facing Blackstone and his men. This land, this cabin, it was all she had left. Without it, who was she? Yet as dawn approached, another fear had taken root. The fear of watching Bradley ride away alone, perhaps never to return. 3 weeks of his company had awakened something she believed long dead. A yearning for connection, for companionship, for something more than mere survival. Foolishness, she whispered to herself. Pure foolishness. But when morning came and Bradley began saddling his horse, Madeline found herself packing a small bag with essential items. By the time the sun had fully risen, she had asked Mr. Fletcher to watch her place, secured her chickens, and was mounting her own mare alongside Bradley. "Just to Fort Benton," she told him firmly. "Just until this business is settled." Bradley's smile was like sunrise breaking across the mountains. "Yes, ma'am. Just until then." As they rode away from the homestead, Madeline refused to look back. Looking back meant acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted, that the solitude she'd claimed as protection now felt more like a prison than a refuge. And that realization was too frightening to face just yet. Fort Benton in 1871 was a bustling riverport town, the furthest point up the Missouri River that steamboats could navigate. Despite having visited only a handful of times since James's death, Madeline felt overwhelmed by the noise and bustle after the quiet of her homestead. Bradley seemed to sense her discomfort, staying close as they made their way toward the territorial marshal's office. His presence beside her drew curious glances. A young widow in the company of a handsome cowboy naturally invited speculation. "Ignore them," Bradley murmured when he noticed her stiffening under the scrutiny. Small towns run on gossip. The marshal's office was a simple wooden structure near the courthouse. Inside, they found Marshal Everett, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, poring over wanted posters. "Bradley Vance," the marshal greeted, recognition lighting his weathered face. "Heard you might be dead. Shot by rustlers up near the Double Cross." "Nearly was," Bradley confirmed, removing his hat. "Marshal, this is Miss Madeline Wright. She saved my life." The marshal nodded respectfully to Madeline before turning his attention back to Bradley. "I take it you're here about Jonas Blackstone." For the next hour, Bradley detailed everything he'd witnessed at the Double Cross Ranch. The systematic theft of cattle from neighboring ranches, the altering of brands, the shipment of stolen stock downriver. He described how he'd confronted Blackstone after finding clear evidence of his crimes, and how the foreman had ordered 2 of his men to take care of the problem permanently. "Left me for dead in a gully," Bradley concluded. "If my horse hadn't stayed nearby, I'd never have made it out." Marshal Everett listened intently, making occasional notes. When Bradley finished, he leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "I've suspected Blackstone for months, but couldn't prove anything. Your testimony changes that. Will you arrest him?" Madeline asked, speaking for the first time since introductions. "I'll do more than that," the marshal assured her. "We'll ride out tomorrow with a proper posse." Rustling's a hanging offense in Montana territory. Bradley nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. That man's brought nothing but trouble to honest folks." As they left the marshal's office, Madeline felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Soon this business would be concluded, Blackstone would face justice, and she could return to her homestead. Everything would go back to normal. Yet as Bradley secured them rooms at the River's Edge Hotel, separate accommodations, with hers directly beside the proprietress's quarters to ensure propriety, Madeline realized that normal no longer held the same appeal. The prospect of returning to her solitary existence seemed suddenly bleak. "The marshal says we should stay in town until after they bring Blackstone in," Bradley explained as they dined in the hotel restaurant that evening. "Safer that way." Madeline nodded, absently pushing food around her plate. The fine china and proper tablecloth felt foreign after years of simple homestead living. More disconcerting was the way Bradley looked in his freshly pressed shirt, hair still damp from a proper bath. He'd always been handsome, but cleaned up and seated across from her in this civilized setting, he was downright devastating. "Is something wrong with the food?" he asked, noticing her distraction. "No," she replied quickly. I'm just not accustomed to such formality anymore. Bradley's expression softened with understanding. We could take our plates up to one of our rooms if you'd be more comfortable, or find somewhere quieter to eat. The suggestion was innocent enough, but the prospect of dining alone with Bradley in a hotel room sent a rush of warmth to Madeline's cheeks. This is fine, she assured him. I should remember how to behave in public if I'm to rejoin civilization occasionally. Is that something you want? He asked, watching her carefully. To rejoin civilization more often? The question caught her off guard. I hadn't given it much thought, she admitted. My homestead keeps me busy enough. It does, Bradley agreed. But surely there are times when you miss this. He gestured to the bustling restaurant. Company, conversation, music. As if on cue, a piano player in the corner began a gentle melody. Several couples rose to dance in the small cleared area beside the piano. Madeline watched them, a forgotten longing stirring in her chest. James had loved to dance. In their brief marriage, they'd attended every social they could, whirling around makeshift dance floors in barns and town halls. Would you care to dance? Bradley asked softly, bringing her attention back to him. She should refuse. Dancing with this man in public would only fuel the gossip already surrounding them. Yet she found herself nodding, placing her napkin beside her plate and rising from her chair. Bradley led her to the dance floor, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. When he took her in his arms, maintaining a proper distance between them, Madeline was startled by how right it felt. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before, his steps matching hers perfectly. You dance well for a cowboy, she observed, trying to maintain some semblance of composure despite the flutter in her chest. Bradley smiled down at her. My mother insisted all her sons learn. Said no woman deserved a man who'd stomp on her toes. A wise woman, your mother. She was, he agreed, a shadow crossing his face. Lost her 5 years ago. Influenza. Madeline's heart squeezed with sympathy. I'm sorry. Thank you. His hand tightened slightly at her waist as he guided her through a turn. She would have liked you. Would she? Madeline couldn't help asking. Very much. She admired strong women who could stand on their own. His blue eyes held her steadily. But she also believed that standing together was always better than standing alone. The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. As the music drew to a close, Bradley's hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for the dance, Miss Wright, he said formally, though his eyes conveyed something far more intimate. Thank you, Mr. Vance, she replied, equally formal despite the color in her cheeks. That night, alone in her hotel room, Madeline stood at the window staring out at the moonlit street below. Fort Benton continued its evening bustle, saloons spilling light and laughter, freighters making last-minute preparations for morning departures, couples strolling arm in arm along the boardwalk. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, suddenly achingly aware of all she'd shut out of her life these past 3 years. Not just dances and proper dinners, but connection itself. Friendship, companionship, the simple comfort of another human presence. It was necessary, she whispered to herself. After James died, I had to focus on survival. But was it still necessary? Or had survival alone become a prison of her own making? As she prepared for bed, Madeline caught a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror. The woman who stared back looked younger somehow, less careworn than she had just weeks ago. There was color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for years. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Bradley Vance had awakened something in her, something she believed dead and buried alongside her husband. And in 2 days' time, when the marshal returned with Blackstone in custody, she would be expected to return to her homestead and her solitary existence as if nothing had changed. Nothing has changed, she told her reflection firmly. Nothing that matters, anyway. But as she slipped between the clean hotel sheets, Madeline knew she was lying to herself. Everything had changed. She had changed. And there was no going back to the woman she'd been before Bradley Vance collapsed in the mud outside her fence. Bradley couldn't sleep. The comfortable hotel bed should have been a welcome change from Madeline's pallet on the floor, but his thoughts wouldn't quiet. Tomorrow, Marshal Everett would ride out with a posse to arrest Blackstone. By this time the next day, the man who tried to kill him would be in custody, facing justice for his crimes. And then what? Bradley had no illusions about his position. Once Blackstone was dealt with, he'd have no reason to remain in Fort Benton. No reason to stay near Madeline. The thought of leaving her twisted something in his chest. In just 3 weeks, she'd become more important to him than he'd thought possible. Her quiet strength, her fierce independence, the rare smile that transformed her serious face, all had worked their way under his skin until he could scarcely remember a time when she hadn't been part of his life. But what could he offer her? He was a ranch hand with nothing to his name but a good horse, a Winchester rifle, and the clothes on his back. Madeline owned her land outright, managed her homestead with capable efficiency, and had made it clear she valued her independence. Fool, he muttered to himself, staring at the ceiling. She's just biding her time until she can return to her solitary life. Yet he couldn't forget the way she'd felt in his arms during their dance, or how her eyes had softened when he spoke of his mother, or the 100 small ways she'd begun to let down her guard around him. A sharp knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. He reached for his gun before calling out, "Who's there?" "It's me," came Madeline's voice, hushed but urgent. "Please open up." Bradley yanked the door open to find her standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour, her face pale in the dim lamplight. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Blackstone is here," she whispered. "In Fort Benton. I just saw him and 2 other men ride past the hotel." Bradley pulled her inside, quickly closing the door behind her. "Are you certain it was him?" "I've never seen him before," she admitted. "But one of the men matched the description you gave, tall, with a scar crossing his right eye." "That's him," Bradley confirmed grimly. He reached for his shirt, pulling it on over his undershirt. "Did they see you?" Madeline shook her head. "I was behind the curtain. They stopped at the saloon across the street." Bradley's mind raced. If Blackstone was in town, it meant the marshal wouldn't find him at the Double Cross tomorrow. Worse, it suggested the foreman might have gotten wind of the investigation. "We need to warn the marshal," he said, buckling on his gun belt. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." Madeline's hand on his arm stopped him. "I'm coming with you. It's safer if we stay together." "Madeline, I didn't save your life just to have you shot in the street," she said firmly. "We go together or not at all." Something in her tone brooked no argument. Bradley nodded, recognizing the steel in her spine that had kept her alive and independent on the frontier. They slipped down the back stairs of the hotel, avoiding the main lobby where they might be seen. The marshal's office was only 2 blocks away, but they would need to pass directly in front of the saloon where Blackstone and his men had stopped. "Stay close," Bradley murmured as they stepped into the shadowed street. They had almost reached the marshal's office when the saloon doors swung open, spilling light and raucous laughter onto the boardwalk. Bradley pulled Madeline into the darkness between 2 buildings, pressing her against the wall and shielding her with his body as 3 men emerged. "Check the hotel next," one was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "He's got to be here somewhere." "And when we find him?" asked another. The first man, unmistakably Blackstone, laughed coldly. "Then we finish what we started. No witnesses this time." Bradley felt Madeline tense against him. They remained motionless until the men had moved past, heading in the direction of their hotel. Only when the footsteps faded did Bradley step back, though his hands lingered on Madeline's shoulders. "They're looking for you," she whispered, her eyes wide in the darkness. "Yes," Bradley agreed grimly. "And they'll check the hotel first. We need to move quickly." The marshal's office was dark when they reached it, a note pinned to the door stating that Everett had been called to a disturbance outside town and wouldn't return until morning. Bradley swore under his breath. "Now what?" Madeline asked, glancing nervously up the street. Bradley considered their options. Without the marshal, they had no official protection. By now, Blackstone and his men would have discovered they weren't at the hotel. It wouldn't take long for them to start searching elsewhere. "We need to get out of town," he decided. "Now tonight. We'll head back to your homestead." "But they'll look for us there," Madeline protested. "Eventually, yes. But it will take them time to discover our connection." Bradley took her hand. "We'll collect our horses and go out the north road. By the time they realize we've fled, we'll have several hours head start." The livery stable was mercifully quiet. They saddled their horses quickly, working by the dim light of a single lantern. As Madeline tightened the cinch on her mare's saddle, Bradley noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "We'll be all right," he assured her, covering her hand with his own. "I won't let any harm come to you." Madeline looked up at him, her face half-shadowed in the lantern light. "It's not me I'm worried about," she admitted softly. The vulnerability in her voice struck Bradley to his core. Before he could respond, the stable doors creaked open. Both froze, reaching instinctively for their weapons. Well, came a cold voice. "Looks like our search is over." Jonas Blackstone stood in the doorway, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant smile. Behind him were the two men who'd accompanied him to the saloon, both with guns drawn. "Vance," Blackstone sneered. "Should have known you'd be too stubborn to die properly." Bradley pushed Madeline behind him, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. "The marshal knows everything, Blackstone. It's over." "Is that so?" The foreman laughed. "Funny, I just paid the good marshal a handsome sum to be elsewhere tonight. Seems not everyone in Montana Territory is as honest as you'd like to believe." The revelation hit Bradley like a physical blow. Everett had been bought off. There would be no justice through official channels. "Now," Blackstone continued, gesturing with his gun, "why don't you and the lady step away from those horses? We've got unfinished business to settle." Bradley's mind raced, calculating angles and distances. 3 against 1 were poor odds under the best circumstances. With Madeline to protect, they were nearly impossible. "Let her go," he said evenly. "She has nothing to do with this." "Oh, I think she does," Blackstone replied, his gaze shifting to Madeline. "Pretty little thing. Been harboring you all this time, has she? That makes her an accessory." One of Blackstone's men moved to circle around them, cutting off their escape toward the back of the stable. Bradley tracked him with his peripheral vision, keeping his gun trained on Blackstone. "When I say run," he whispered to Madeline, "get on your horse and go. Don't look back." "I won't leave you," she hissed back. "You have to," Bradley insisted. "Someone needs to get word to Mr. Harrington. He's the only one who can stop this now." Before Madeline could argue further, Bradley fired, the shot deliberately wide but enough to startle Blackstone and his men. "Run," he shouted, firing again to provide cover. Chaos erupted in the small stable. Horses whinnied in terror, men shouted, and gunshots echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space. Bradley saw Madeline swing onto her mare's back, grabbing the reins of his own horse as she urged both animals toward the stable doors. A bullet whizzed past his ear as he fired again, this time hitting one of Blackstone's men in the shoulder. The man cursed, dropping his gun and clutching the wound. "Go," Bradley yelled as Madeline hesitated at the doorway. "I'll be right behind you." She locked eyes with him for one desperate moment before spurring her horse forward, disappearing into the night with his mount in tow. Relief flooded Bradley even as he ducked behind a stall door to avoid Blackstone's returning fire. "You're dead, Vance," the foreman shouted. "And when I'm done with you, I'll find that woman of yours." The threat against Madeline ignited something primal in Bradley's chest. He had to get out of this stable, had to make sure she got safely away. With renewed determination, he waited for a break in the gunfire before making his move. Rolling from his position, he fired twice in quick succession, forcing Blackstone and his remaining man to take cover. Then he was running, sprinting for the back door of the stable. Bullets splintered wood around him as he burst into the alley behind the livery. Outside, Bradley paused just long enough to get his bearings. The sound of hoofbeats to the north told him Madeline had followed his instructions and was riding out of town. Good. If he could create enough of a diversion, she might get clear before Blackstone realized she was gone. With that thought in mind, Bradley headed in the opposite direction, toward the riverfront. Behind him, he could hear Blackstone shouting orders as they emerged from the stable. The chase was on, and Bradley knew his only hope was to lead them away from Madeline's escape route. For nearly an hour, he played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the darkened streets and alleys of Fort Benton. Twice he exchanged gunfire with his pursuers, and once he was certain he'd hit Blackstone's remaining man. But the foreman himself remained doggedly on his trail. Finally, exhausted and running low on ammunition, Bradley found himself cornered near the steamboat landing. The Missouri River flowed dark and swift behind him, offering his only possible escape. "End of the line, Vance," Blackstone called, stepping from the shadows with his gun leveled. Blood streaked one side of the foreman's face where a bullet had grazed him during their earlier exchange. "No more running." "Seems that way," Bradley agreed, his own gun held steady despite his fatigue. "But you won't walk away from this either, Blackstone. Too many people know what you've done." The foreman's scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. One witness left, that woman of yours. And I'll find her soon enough. You won't touch her, Bradley growled, every protective instinct flaring. Watch me. Blackstone sneered and fired. Pain exploded in Bradley's left shoulder as the bullet struck home. He staggered backward, dangerously close to the river's edge, but managed to keep his footing and his grip on his gun. Not so easy to kill, he gritted out, raising his weapon despite the agony in his shoulder. Both men fired simultaneously. Bradley felt a second bullet graze his side, but had the satisfaction of seeing Blackstone jerk backward as his own shot found its mark. The foreman clutched his chest, shock registering on his face before he crumpled to the ground. For a long moment, Bradley stood swaying, his gun still trained on Blackstone's motionless form. Only when he was certain the man wouldn't rise again did he allow himself to assess his own injuries. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily, and the graze along his side burned like fire. Madeline, he murmured, thinking of her riding alone in the darkness. He needed to find her, to make sure she was safe. With the last of his strength, Bradley holstered his gun and staggered toward the road leading north out of town. He made it perhaps 50 yards before the blood loss overcame him. As consciousness began to fade, his last thought was of Madeline's face, and the regret that he might never see it again. Madeline rode hard for nearly 2 miles before realizing that Bradley wasn't behind her. She reined her mare to a halt, Bradley's horse still following on the lead line, and strained to hear any sound of pursuit over her pounding heart. Nothing but the whisper of prairie grass and the distant hoot of an owl broke the night silence. He said he'd be right behind me, she whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. Logic told her to keep riding, to get word to Mr. Harrington as Bradley had instructed. But her heart rebelled at the thought of leaving him to face Blackstone alone. The man she'd once been, the woman who believed isolation was safer than connection, might have continued on. But that woman no longer existed. With a decisive tug on the reins, Madeline turned both horses around. Come on, she urged them. We're going back. The ride back to Fort Benton seemed interminable. She approached cautiously, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the shadows as she made her way toward the livery stable. The building stood silent and dark, no sign of the gunfight that had erupted there earlier. For nearly an hour, Madeline searched the town, her fear growing with each empty street and alley. Had Blackstone taken Bradley somewhere? Had he already? She couldn't complete the thought. Instead, she urged her tired mare toward the riverfront, the last area she hadn't checked. The pale light of approaching dawn revealed a figure lying crumpled on the road leading north. Madeline's heart stopped as she recognized Bradley's form. Dismounting before her horse had fully halted, she ran to him, falling to her knees beside his still body. "Bradley!" she cried, frantically searching for signs of life. His shirt was soaked with blood, his face alarmingly pale, but a faint pulse still beat at his throat. "Bradley, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered at the sound of her voice. "Madeline," he whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. "You came back." "Of course I came back, you fool," she said, tears threatening as she examined his wounds. "I told you I wouldn't leave you." A weak smile touched his lips. "Stubborn woman." "Hush," she ordered, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his shoulder. "Save your strength. We need to get you help." Bradley's hand caught hers, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "Blackstone," he said urgently, "down by the landing. I shot him, but you need to be careful." Madeline nodded. "I'll check, but first I need to stop this bleeding." She worked quickly, using the skills she'd developed during 3 years of solitary frontier living. When she'd done what she could, she helped Bradley sit up, supporting him against her shoulder. "Can you stand if I help you?" she asked. "I think so," he replied, though his face was gray with pain and exertion. Together they managed to get him on his feet, and, after a struggle that left them both breathless, onto his horse. Madeline mounted her own mare and led them cautiously toward the steamboat landing. In the growing light, they found Blackstone's body where Bradley had left him. The foreman lay face up, eyes staring sightlessly at the lightening sky, a dark stain spreading across his chest. "It's over," Madeline said softly. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." Bradley nodded weakly, swaying slightly in his saddle. "We need to find the marshal. Bought off or not, he's the law here." They found Marshal Everett returning to town, just as the sun crested the horizon. Whatever arrangement he'd had with Blackstone clearly hadn't included murder. The color drained from his face when he saw Bradley's condition and heard what had transpired. "I never intended," he began, but Bradley cut him off. "Save it for the judge," he said coldly. "Your corruption cost lives." To his credit, Everett didn't attempt further excuses. He took custody of Blackstone's body, located the wounded henchman Bradley had shot in the stable, and arranged for the town doctor to tend to Bradley's injuries. By midday, telegrams had been sent to Mr. Harrington and the territorial governor reporting the night's events. The doctor insisted Bradley remain in Fort Benton for at least a week while his wounds healed. Madeline took a room adjoining his at the hotel, refusing to leave his side despite the raised eyebrows and whispered gossip their arrangement provoked. "People will talk," Bradley warned her on the third day, when he was finally strong enough to sit up without assistance. Madeline, who was changing the dressing on his shoulder, merely shrugged. "Let them. I've stopped caring what others think of me." Bradley caught her hand, halting her work. "I haven't," he said seriously. "Your reputation matters, Madeline." She met his gaze steadily. "Does it? 3 years I've lived alone, working a homestead, trading with trappers and Indians, doing what needed to be done. Do you think anyone approves of that? A young widow should remarry or go east to family, not cling to frontier independence." "That's different," Bradley argued. "That's strength and determination. This," he gestured between them. "This looks like something else entirely." "Perhaps it is something else," Madeline said quietly, her heart pounding as she voiced the thought that had been growing since their dance at the hotel. "Perhaps I want it to be." Bradley went very still, his blue eyes searching her face as if afraid to believe what he was hearing. "Madeline," he said carefully, "I have nothing to offer you. No land, no home." "I have land," she interrupted. "I have a home. What I don't have is someone to share it with." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Unless you're not interested in such an arrangement." For a moment, Bradley said nothing, and Madeline feared she'd gravely misread the situation. Then his free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Interested doesn't begin to describe it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I woke in your cabin, I've been falling in love with you. But I couldn't ask you to give up your independence for a man with nothing to his name." "Nothing," Madeline repeated, leaning into his touch. "You have honor, courage, kindness, everything that matters. The rest we can build together." Bradley's eyes held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Are you certain? Your life would change. People would talk even more than they do now." Madeline smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Let them talk. I'd rather have love and gossip than solitude and respectability." The kiss that followed was gentle, mindful of Bradley's injuries, but filled with promise. When they finally parted, both were smiling despite the tears in their eyes. "I should warn you," Bradley said, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I have 5 brothers. If I write to tell them I'm settling down with the most beautiful woman in Montana Territory, they'll all come visiting at once." Madeline laughed, the sound bright and free in a way she hadn't laughed since before James died. "I think I can handle a few more Vance men," she assured him, "as long as they're all as well behaved as you." "Well now," Bradley said with a mischievous glint, "I wouldn't go that far." Summer faded into autumn, and autumn gave way to the first snows of winter. On the Wright homestead, now the Wright Vance homestead, as the small wooden sign at the gate proclaimed, preparations for the cold months were well underway. Bradley worked steadily, splitting logs for the expanded woodpile that would see them through until spring. The cabin itself had grown during the fall months, with a new bedroom added to the original structure and the roof raised to create a small loft space. The improvements had been Bradley's wedding gift to Madeline, built with his own hands and the help of neighbors who'd come to respect the young couple's determination. Inside, Madeline moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preserving the last of the garden's bounty. The smell of apple butter simmering on the stove filled the cabin with warmth and sweetness. Their wedding had been a simple affair at the Fort Benton church in late August, attended by a handful of neighbors, Mr. Harrington from the Double Cross Ranch, and, true to Bradley's prediction, all 5 of his brothers who'd traveled from as far as Wyoming and Nebraska for the occasion. Mr. Harrington, grateful for Bradley's role in exposing Blackstone's criminal activities, had offered him a permanent position as foreman of the Double Cross. Bradley had considered it seriously. The salary was generous, and the position respected, but in the end, he and Madeline had decided that their future lay with the homestead they were building together. "We can make this land prosperous," Madeline had said as they discussed their options. "Between your ranching knowledge and my farming experience, we could have something that truly belongs to us both." Bradley had agreed, touched by her insistence that the homestead be their shared endeavor rather than simply her property that he worked. They'd registered the revised deed together at the land office, equal partners in all respects. Now, as Bradley carried the last armload of firewood into the cabin, he paused to watch Madeline stirring the apple butter. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and the simple gold band on her left hand gleamed as she worked. "That smells amazing," he said, setting the wood in the box beside the stove. Madeline glanced up, a smile transforming her face. No longer did she wear the closed, guarded expression that had greeted him when he first regained consciousness in her cabin. Now her eyes held warmth, her smile came easily, and her entire bearing spoke of a woman who had found contentment. "It's almost ready," she told him, offering the wooden spoon for him to taste. "What do you think? More cinnamon?" Bradley savored the sweet mixture, then shook his head. "Perfect as is. Like everything you make." Madeline rolled her eyes at the compliment, though a pleased flush colored her cheeks. "Flatterer. You'd say that even if I burned it black." "Maybe," he admitted with a grin, catching her around the waist and pulling her close. "But only because I'd be distracted by the cook." She laughed, settling comfortably against him. "The cook has work to finish before she can be properly distracting." Bradley reluctantly released her, though not before stealing a quick kiss. "Fair enough. I should check on that north fence line again anyway." The last storm knocked down a section. As he pulled on his coat and hat, Madeline watched him with a contemplative expression. "I was thinking," she said suddenly. "A dangerous pastime," he teased. She ignored the jest. "I was thinking we might invite your brothers for Christmas. All of them. The cabin's big enough now, and I'd like to start creating our own traditions." Bradley paused at the door, studying his wife's face. When they'd first discussed marriage, Madeline had been hesitant about having extended family visit too frequently, worried that it might overwhelm her after so many years of solitude. "Are you sure?" he asked. "That's a lot of Vance men under one roof." Madeline nodded decisively. "I'm sure. This place has been quiet for too long." She hesitated, then added more softly. "Besides, they should get to know their niece or nephew before spring." For a moment, Bradley wasn't certain he'd heard correctly. Then understanding dawned, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides, gathering Madeline into his arms. "A baby?" he whispered, searching her face for confirmation. "We're having a baby?" Madeline nodded, happy tears shining in her eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies. He thinks sometime in early May." Bradley whooped with joy, lifting Madeline off her feet and spinning her in a careful circle. "A baby," he repeated, awestruck. "Our baby." Setting her gently back on her feet, he placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "Are you feeling well? Do you need anything? Should you be on your feet cooking?" Madeline laughed, covering his hand with her own. "I'm perfectly fine, and women have been cooking while carrying babies since the beginning of time. Dr. Miller says I'm healthy as can be." Bradley kissed her then, pouring all his love and joy into the gesture. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "I love you, Madeline Vance," he said softly. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, her voice steady with certainty. "For saving me from a life half-lived." Bradley shook his head. "You saved me first," he reminded her. "Literally pulled me from the mud and nursed me back to health. Then I suppose we saved each other," Madeline concluded, her smile softening. "And now we'll build something worth saving, together." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall outside, Bradley held his wife close, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. 6 months ago, he'd been a solitary ranch hand with no permanent home and no real connections. Now he had a wife he adored, a homestead they were building together, and a child on the way. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving in many ways. But its challenges no longer seemed insurmountable. With Madeline by his side, Bradley knew they could weather whatever storms came their way, literal or figurative. Later that evening, as they sat together before the fire, Bradley's arm around Madeline's shoulders and her head resting comfortably against him, he thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. A bullet that should have killed him, a storm that nearly had, and a stubborn, compassionate woman who'd refused to let either claim him. "What are you thinking about?" Madeline asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "How fortunate I am," he replied honestly. "That bullet nearly took my life, but instead it led me to you." Madeline's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Perhaps it wasn't just luck," she suggested. "Perhaps we were always meant to find each other." Bradley smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I like that thought, that even in this vast wilderness, we were somehow destined to meet." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the homestead in pristine white. But inside the cabin, warmth reigned, not just from the crackling fire, but from the love between two people who had found in each other the healing they both desperately needed. The lonely widow and the wounded cowboy had indeed healed together under the western sky, building from their separate sorrows a shared joy neither had dared to imagine possible. And as winter settled over the Montana territory, their hearts remained warm with the certainty that the life they were creating together would only grow richer with each passing season.